and welcome back to Book and Page. Chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bounds. Which is weird to say because we're still missing a dwarf. Let's get us a dwarf. Okay, so we start off this chapter back with Bilbo and the rest of the company, considering we ended the chapter with Thorin. And the Wood Elves have shown up and have captured the dwarves, which is to say none of the dwarves put up a fight because... how? Except for Bilbo. Bilbo pops on his ring, disappears, and follows after them. So the dwarves are taken into Mirkwood. They also have a bit of a fight with the Wood King because they're hungry. So the Wood King throws them all into their own cells, does feed them, but says that they're not getting out until one of them tells me what I want. And they do not tell them that Thorin is there. Bilbo finds them. Bilbo locates all of the dwarf cells and finds out Thorin's there, and then locates Thorin, and spends a lot of time trying to figure out how he's going to get all of these dwarves out. Opportunity strikes. The butler and the chief of guards get drunk and fall asleep one night, so Bilbo steals the keys and frees all the dwarves. And then tells them, get in the barrels, we're getting out of here. Well, the dwarves decide they don't like that plan, and Bilbo says, well, you're gonna deal with it. So he packs them all into different barrels, as neatly as he can, puts the lids on, and then more elves show up, wake the butler up, and push all the barrels into the water. And just as they're doing this, with a song of course, Bilbo sort of realizes, I'm not in a barrel, grabs hold of the last barrel and gets pushed into the water, basically with the barrel on top of him, and then he just, like, rides the barrel out, just trying to keep his head above water, and they head on down the river. Now, Bilbo manages to get up and out of the water at one point when they hit sort of a checkpoint with some elves, sneaks in and gets some food, and then gets back to the barrels, and they're sent further on down the river. And that's where we end. All the dwarves are packed in barrels, and Bilbo is invisible, which he is for most of this chapter. Okay, time to get serious. This is never, this isn't super fun, happy times. Let's talk about the morality of stealing food. I told you this was not going to be fun. Alright, so Bilbo has to steal food repeatedly throughout this chapter from the elves in order to survive, because he's not getting fed because they don't know he exists. And for the start of the chapter, it's sort of like pushed off to the side, but Tolkien makes it very explicit at the end of this chapter, where Bilbo sneaks into this little village and, like, almost get caught, but he escapes with, like, a loaf of bread, a thing of mead, and an entire pie, which, I mean, could be a smaller pie, but I'm still thinking of, like, an entire pie, for himself to eat. And so at first you can definitely see the necessity of it, but the second part seems to be less about him starving and more about him just wanting some really good food at that point. But there's always going to be a moral question attached to that. Like, is Bilbo in the right to steal food because it's how he'll survive? Especially that second bit where it seems more excessive, like Bilbo is becoming more comfortable with doing something like that. Like, if you look at black and white philosophy, which is sort of the word of law for the most part, the answer is no, it's not okay. The idea being, of course, if it's wrong, then it's wrong no matter the circumstances. So taking other people's possessions is wrong in and of itself, and you can't put, like, an asterisk beside it with unless following after it. Like, you have to be really strict about it, so that people don't start taking advantages of those asterisks attached. The way I've heard this worded is the idea that you should not do anything that you wouldn't want everybody else to do. So if you take something, you're allowing for the idea that everybody could take something. So you'd say stealing is wrong because you don't want everybody to be able to steal, just as you'd say killing a person is wrong because you don't want everybody to just kill people. But the issue with that being is the need to survive is attached to it. And that comes up even in the killing people example. Killing people is always wrong, so you should never kill somebody. But what happens if you are being attacked and then kill that person in self-defense? Like, we're in a deeply gray area here, especially when it comes to Bilbo in this case, because he's not doing anything violent, at least not violent in the sense that we would put it, though some people might define the taking of somebody else's possessions as a different type of violence against that person, a violence against their ownership. But there's a need for survival here. Bilbo is starving. If he doesn't steal food to eat, he could die. But if we just say it's wrong no matter what, then we can't condone Bilbo's actions here. Another moral system we could take a look at is more the utilitarian system. And to real basics, because it certainly gets a little more complicated than this, utilitarianism is if the act produces good outcomes for the most people, then it is a good act. It's about the utilitarian for the greater good. So, in that sense, then yes, we can allow for Bilbo morally being justified in stealing food here, because not only does it constitute his survival, but it actually helps with the survival of the dwarves, gaining their freedom, nor does it seem like he's taking something that the elves need. The elves don't seem to be starving themselves, where every little bit counts. And you can see this with the fact that when they're moving the barrels, they feel that some are very heavy. Of course, we know there's dwarves in them. But they make the assumption that the barrels haven't been emptied. And no one's saying, hey, maybe we should chuck those into the water. Like, they sort of rib each other like, well, the butler will be blamed if the king gets mad about it, because the men of Lake Town are feasting on his thing. No one stops to check. Like, if this was a starving people, they'd be opening all those barrels. Like, what did we miss? So the elves don't seem to be bothered by this small loss of food that Bilbo is actually keeping. They seem to be willing to throw out far greater amounts of food. So, within utilitarianism, Bilbo's act is a good act because it does good for the most people, both himself and the dwarves. Well, but in that case with the elves, that might be different, because what if for the elves, keeping the dwarves in prison is a better outcome than having them escape? Especially considering, again, Bilbo stealing food here allows him to help the dwarves escape, which allows the dwarves and Bilbo to then wake Smaug up, and Smaug then destroys Lake Town. Overall, is this a morally sound act? Utilitarianism is a system where, very surface level, oh yeah, I can understand that. If an act produces good results, it's a good act. If it produces bad results, it produces a bad act. Until it gets more complicated than that, and the question of what act and consequences becomes much broader. So, is Bilbo stealing food here morally sound? Most people aren't going to blame him for fighting for his own survival, especially since he does not take anything necessary from anybody else. He's not taking food out of another person's starving mouth. And he doesn't do it in any violent manner. But rule of law would say no. But human decency would say yes. Which is why, in fact, law systems generally have judges. Because if you just go by the word of law and don't take into the account human factors situations, circumstances, anything like that, you're more likely to do harm within that law than good. But it never is an easy conversation. You're always going to have people on both sides. So, yeah, it's a lot of Bilbo today because we're hanging out with Bilbo. And the moral question, of course, is deeply complicated by the fact that he has a ring that we know starts to actually whisper things to him. So, but there are points where we see Bilbo without the ring, usually with the dwarves. And may I introduce Sass Master Bilbo? Not a lot to say on this one, but I just appreciate just the utter smackdown he is willing to bring to these dwarves when all they do is complain about how he's going to get them out of here. Like, they've started trusting Bilbo, and apparently this means that they don't have to do anything at this point. Just wait for Bilbo to solve everything. And then they're dicks about it. What are you talking about? This is the only way out. Because I've actually had a chance to study things, and this is the only way out. And the fact that, like, straight up, they complain about it. He says, we're gonna pack you in barrels, send down the river, and we're out. And they're all just like, nope. And he's like, fine. Come on, I'll put you all back in your cells. Let's go. And that makes them stop and think, like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. It speaks to that idea that, like, beggars can't be choosers here. None of the dwarves have shown any willingness to try and figure out a way out. A different way out. None of them want to talk with the Wood King. None of them want to work that communication line. So it comes down to Bilbo, so the dwarves are just going to have to trust Bilbo on this one and accept what he says. Which, I mean, eventually they do, but it's a whole lot of grumbling. Even from Thorin, who's just like, "Rrr." And Bilbo's reminded of a big dog in a small cage. And in fact, we'll see more of this smackdown when it does let them out of the barrels, and very few of them are willing to help. And Bilbo has to do, like, the Z-snap to Thorin to get him up and moving. Like, what? Let's do it. So, Sass Master Bilbo, he's finally comfortable enough that he's willing to give the dwarves a smackdown when they need it. Honestly, like, the dwarves have spent most of this journey complaining that Bilbo hasn't been useful. He has stepped up, and he's about the only useful member of the company for these past couple of chapters. The dwarves, for the most part, have gotten severely beaten up. So, I mean, it's interesting to see a damsel in distress narrative that is not, like, the girl. It turns out it's 13 dwarves, and poor Bilbo just like, okay, whatever, fine, let's do this, let's go. And go they do. They eventually suck it up and get into the barrels. And we have an interesting exchange of some elves that Bilbo's watching that come in to push the barrels, who, I mean, these elves, again, don't seem to be, like, super, we're all in this together. Because they walk in, of course, and the butler and the king of the head guard are all the drunk. And, I mean, they wake the butler up and then say, like, don't bother waking the guard because he's had enough. Give us some wine. Like, none of these elves have a problem with drinking the king's own wine, which we've been told that it's supposed to just be for the king's feast. So I guess he's holding things back from his own people as much as he's holding things back from the dwarves. And his own people are just like, nope. Give me some food, give me some drink. Yeah, they literally drank around before they actually do the thing that they're supposed to do, which I suppose is helpful because they're all joking about the fact that the barrels are still heavier. And the butler's super embarrassed, so the butler's like, just put them in the water. And of course we get song with it. Now, at first we get sort of a little nonsense song about rolling and dropping the barrels. And then, oddly enough, we get a longer song not in stanzas, it's all one together. And it's a lovely little song about traveling back south and floating beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes waving weeds, up from through the mist that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night, follow, follow, stars that leap, up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away, seek the sunlight and the day. That's just a section from the middle, and it's, again, longer than that. Which is a really in-depth song to sing to some empty barrels sending down to Lake Town, which is the context that, of course, the elves are singing it in, but we actually have a different context, which is to say there are dwarves in those barrels that are returning home. One of the lines that's actually repeated twice is, "Back to the lands you once did know." That song, again, is spoken by the elves out of context. In our context, it is very meaningful, because this is sort of a liminal place here in Mirkwood, where they're not really moving, they're in an in-between space. So this moment where they're actually being pushed off in the barrels is the moment they're going to come to the very foot of the mountain. When they get out, they're going to be at Lake Town, and the Lonely Mountain's going to be there. They're going to be much closer home than they have been this entire journey, and it's through this one passage moment that is deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it's a very meaningful moment that's accented with the elves actually singing them out, which we can assume probably happened with Rivendell as well, but these elves aren't aware they're singing them out. This song isn't meant for the dwarves, but it has some real meaning for the dwarves, especially, interestingly enough, the connection between Leaping Light of Stars, both here and the prior wind song that the dwarves sang when they were at Bjorn's house. We see that there is a connection between the two groups that could be really very deep and meaningful if they were willing to connect on that level, but these two groups can't. We saw a much better connection between Elrond and his group of elves and the dwarves than between the wood elves and the dwarves here. But there's still something, it's a conversation happening into a void where both sides can hear it without realizing that the other side is involved, or meaning something like that. And we could take it to mean something really important, which is this song, oh, we're into the final crossing point, and we're going to the Lonely Mountain, we're returning to the lands we belonged to, and there's an admission there that, again, both sides aren't speaking. The elves are almost speaking for the dwarves here in a really meaningful way, without any side meaning for that to be happening. It's fascinating, and I love Tolkien's music. Oh, I read that and I could have been in tears. Okay, so lovely song, and not so lovely trip for everybody. And for the most part, the dwarves just sort of hang out for a while in some barrels, but we will get them out. In the next chapter, we're at the Lonely Mountain, or at least a step away from it, and we're going to have our last rest before all of this goes really wrong. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.